Well, today is our 100th episode, and I am really grateful to have you joining us on this 15th day of September 2025 as summer winds down, and as our fifth season winds down, which will conclude in November. So we have a few more episodes to go before we wrap up things for the year. I had some ideas for how I wanted to commemorate our 100th episode, but those were mostly discarded in the wake of what happened last week in Utah with the murder of Charlie Kirk for some very specific reasons, as I will explain as we meander our way through some of the issues that I'd like to explore with you. I need to and I want to address what happened, um, how it was covered in the press, and the social conditions that seem to have made a horrible event like this more likely to occur, and that will continue to make events like this more likely to occur in the future. Simply to maintain the integrity of this show, Crime in the Courtroom, it would be an unforgivable mistake, as far as I can tell, for us to ignore it. The downstream effects of what happened have profound implications not only for public safety and for reasons we may soon see, the holding of a public trial, assuming there isn't a guilty plea, but also for our quality of life and our ability to maintain that quality of life. One of the things that became clear as last week pressed on and the manhunt was underway for Charlie's killer was that there's a growing consensus among reasonable people in our society that our quality of life is not only being threatened, but seems to be deteriorating. So we will tackle some of these issues today, and I'll offer what I think will be a unique perspective on what's going on, and I hope you'll share this episode with others in your network. I'd very much appreciate it. Your support is very important to our show. Speaking of quality of life, I first want to again extend my sincere thanks to our friends and colleagues at Promega, our season sponsor and the host of the International Symposium on Human Identification, the largest conference in existence dedicated to the practice, challenges, and opportunities of forensic DNA testing. As I've been mentioning for some time now, we will be in Palm Beach, Florida this year, November 3rd to November 6th. I really hope to see you there, and I'm going to be working with my esteemed colleagues, Pam Marshall, Julie Sikorsky, and Ray Wickenheiser in delivering a leadership workshop for forensic DNA managers, as we've done for a number of years. We will be offering one-on-one coaching sessions for attendees on the Monday of the symposium. So please email me at office@criticalvictories.com if you plan to be in attendance and would like to take advantage of that offering. The outstanding team of life science experts at Promega are turning questions into discoveries each and every day. And you can learn more at promega.com. And for more information about our upcoming symposium in November, please visit ishinews.com. That's ishinews.com. I was working from my hotel room last Wednesday in Santa Fe, New Mexico, getting ready to facilitate our strength-based leadership and teamwork workshop for a team of forensic scientists at the New Mexico Department of Public Safety's forensic laboratory there in Santa Fe. A beautiful laboratory, by the way. I was really impressed. It's about 2 years old, beautiful building with lots of sunlight coming in, and a really modern training room that we were using. I arrived Tuesday night and spent most of Wednesday getting myself ready to deliver 2 days of training for my colleagues there. For some reason, earlier this year, I started seeing video clips of this Charlie Kirk guy. I knew who he was because I had seen some of his posts when he first started his Turning Point USA organization as a teenager. But at that time, I didn't pay a lot of attention to his work or his mission, or we might even say his ministry, as he was a devout Christian and was rather effective at sharing the essence of his faith. Earlier this year, when I came across one of his video clips, I was really taken aback by how much he had matured and how much his oratory skills had expanded since I had first seen him as a public speaker myself, I really took an interest in him because I was so impressed with his confidence, his speaking skills, and his debating skills, which are now legendary. He was doing something really important, engaging young people in conversations he knew they were craving to have and weren't having on college campuses that are supposed to encourage debate and the development of the the intellectual strength and communication skills you need to participate in those debates. That is why debates and challenging conversations are so important because you have to grow and mature in order to participate in them. You don't need those skills to make noise in an echo chamber where everyone agrees with each other. So, whether people agreed with Charlie Kirk or liked him or didn't like him, you could not deny the force of nature that he was and the historical significance he was building for himself each and every time he went out to facilitate these conversations. The analysis of who Charlie Kirk was and his significance as a historical figure is going to be discussed and debated, and it's not my goal here to do that. Instead, I want to conduct a thought analysis on the crime that was committed and how it was reported in its immediate aftermath. I also want to explore why it happened and why the conditions that gave rise to it are so important to both understand and confront as members of a civilized society who very much want to make sure it remains civilized. So, Charlie Kirk, as you probably know, was shot with a bolt action rifle from the top of a building that gave the shooter a clear view of Charlie as he was engaging with students at uh, Utah Valley University. By all accounts, he was a loving husband and a doting father to two very young children who now have to live without him in their lives, at least not physically. Considering this, how valuable he was to his family and to his millions of fans, and recalling the shot that was fired at Donald Trump during the 2024 presidential campaign, I simply cannot understand, especially with the amazing drone technology we have and how much easier it makes aerial surveillance, how this shooter wasn't spotted ahead of time and some kind of signal sent to Charlie Kirk's security team to cover him up and get him out of there. There may be facts that'll speak to this and clarify it for us so that future public events can be better scanned for threats, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we won't be able to survive as a republic if our best and brightest are afraid to go out in public to talk about difficult issues. If that's the case, the American experiment is over. But like you, I hope that is not the case. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, you saw journalists and various commentators beginning to speculate well before the suspect was identified and arrested that they killed Charlie. They. And they were characterized as the radical left wing. And perhaps that was true. And now it does appear that the 22-year-old shooter did, in fact, become politically radicalized and had become increasingly isolated from his family as he spiraled down whatever dark hole he was falling into. But as someone who was involved in one of the biggest criminal investigations in history and one of the biggest manhunts in history, the hunt for Eric Rudolph after the bombing of the 1996 Olympics, after which or during which an innocent man, Richard Jewell, had his life destroyed by wild speculations being spread by authorities in charge of the investigation and the press that couldn't wait to break those stories about him. It was really frustrating for me to see speculations that they killed Charlie Kirk, that this was a grand institutionalized conspiracy enabled and endorsed by those on the left. The problem with that kind of speculation or potentially false assumption is that when you do that, you feed the societal dysfunction that seems to be making horrors like this more likely to occur. I want to share a perspective with you on this topic of wing violence because it's very important. After Charlie Kirk's murder, uh, President Trump addressed the nation and made several mentions of what he described as the plague of left-wing violence. Again, this was before we knew who did this. We had no way of knowing if this was a killing organized and executed as a way to silence a voice because of its political strength for political purposes, or if this was a murder perpetrated by a nobody, a wayward soul or sick individual who was hearing voices in his head telling him to kill Charlie Kirk. We didn't know. In fact, I would say despite some of the news reports about the killer's political and social motives, I'm not sure we yet know why he did this or if we can ever know. The far left political wing of our country, which I guess could be described, I suppose, as the totalitarian radical Marxists among us who believe that everything good in America came as the result of the exploitation or oppression of others. And it includes some who are clearly willing and able to inflict horrible violence upon those they see as advocating for what they argue are traditional American kinds of values. In recent years, they seem to enjoy this radical left accusing traditional American advocates of being fascists, a label that's been thrown around a lot recently, or comparing conservative leaders to Nazis or modern day versions of Hitler. Of course, you can understand how this rhetoric can be destructive and potentially inflame violence, but we would be grossly mistaken if we allowed ourselves to believe that the far left has a monopoly on the perpetration of wing violence. They do not. Back in 1995 and 1996, around that time, when the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, where I worked in the agency's Atlanta forensic laboratory, was working with federal agencies to develop and execute a security plan for the Olympic Games, there was a tremendous concern among authorities about the threat of right-wing violence, which had already shown itself to be a growing problem in other parts of the country. Timothy McVeigh and his bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City was one example. Eventually, Eric Rudolph, the radicalized right-wing perpetrator of the Atlanta serial bombings, including the bombing of the Olympics at Centennial Olympic Park, claimed in letters he sent to investigators that he was a member of the Army of God. He viewed the Olympic Games as the imposition of the New World Order onto the United States, a sort of international takeover of America, as these activists openly claimed. Now, this was all before the internet as we know it, and certainly social media. And so you ask yourself, what caused these individuals on the far right wing to become radicalized? Well, there's lots of reasons, as you might expect. And I specifically recall that after Bill Clinton was elected president of the United States in 1992, there was a, uh, a coalescing of the far political right. Bill Clinton was going to take everyone's guns. He was going to sell out America to this new world order that would destroy the American way of life and expose freedom-loving Americans to the whims of left-wing socialist ideologues in the international community. From the available records, we know that Eric Rudolph saw the Olympic Games as the New World Order coming to destroy the American way of life. Now, it just so happens that I grew up in a conservative family. I I was a proud Republican when I was in high school and college, and I thought anyone who wasn't a Republican was just an idiot. Since then, maturity and life experiences that made me more empathetic to the challenges of people um, that many people have in our society have softened my own political views a good bit. And I do consider myself to be right of center politically, but certainly not far right to the extent that that matters. Back in those days, I was a big fan of Rush Limbaugh, the conservative AM radio host, and arguably, regardless of what you may think of him, the most talented and influential radio personality in history. Immediately after Bill Clinton's election, and some of you may remember this, Rush initiated each and every episode of his show, which ran for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, with replays on the weekend for all 8 years of the Clinton presidency, with, quote, America held hostage, end quote. Each and every show, America held hostage, as if it were a special breaking news alert. For reasonable people in his audience, we understood that Rush was really an entertainer, and he often reminded his audience of that. He was not a journalist. The American held hostage line seemed kind of funny and seemed pretty harmless to reasonable people. But in every population and within every social circle, you have people who, for whatever reason, are holding on for dear life to maintain their sanity and to function effectively and constructively in modern society. These are people who are just one or two steps away from losing themselves in their own illness, their own ideological fog, or their own antisocial tendencies, which sometimes includes psychopathy. And you can listen to my interview with Dr. Jackie Helfgott to learn more about psychopaths who comprise about 2 to 4% of the human population at any one time. So Rush's America Held Hostage intro for every show he did for 8 years, as I recall, in my opinion, played a role in the right-wing violence we saw in the 1990s. Does that mean Rush was calling for violence? Absolutely not. And I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. But are certain people more vulnerable to that kind of messaging and more likely to interpret it as evidence that they are being threatened in some way, that their well-being or the well-being of their families or community or country is under assault and requires protection? And the answer is yes. I have read a lot about the the life and sickness of Eric Rudolph because I was personally connected to the crimes he committed. I see the murder of Charlie Kirk, at least as it stands right now, as having some deep and disturbing similarities. Both crimes appear to have been committed by individuals who at one time were considered by their friends and families to be thoughtful, even sweet, upstanding citizens. But under the radar, these individuals underwent a slow and sustained withdrawal from civilized society. In their isolation, they exposed themselves to echo chambers, saturating their minds with beliefs and fears that radically altered their perceptions of reality. As a result, they were pulled to the opposite far fringes of political thought. And if you go far enough toward those fringes, right or left, you won't be able to come back because you will have divorced yourself from everyone and everything that could potentially connect you with reality. I'll give you an example that serves as a good analogy for what happens to people when they lose themselves and their connection to civilized society and to reality itself. If you've ever been to Stone Mountain in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, You can take a cable car or a gondola up to the top of this enormous granite outcropping that rises about 500 feet above the surface level. It's really cool. When I when I lived in Atlanta, I used to go out there and walk up the trail up the western slope of the rock. And when you get to the top, you feel like you're on the moon. And as you creep toward the north face, which is the steep face with the huge carvings commemorating Confederate leadership during the Civil War, there's a small fence that keeps you from going too far toward the curve of the slope. It would be easy to climb over that fence, at least it was in the early 1990s. I remember wondering how far out could I go to that point where the top of the mountain curves over and becomes the vertical face before I wouldn't be able to stop myself from falling down the north face. It was just kind of a funny thing to think about. And in science, we actually have a term for that, which is called the event horizon. The event horizon is that point that if you cross it, gravity will prevent you from being able to go back. You will be lost forever. When I think about the political or social wings we have in America on both the right and the left, each has an event horizon where if you go too far, if you divorce yourself from reality and common sense and the people in your life who are part of that reality, and if you isolate yourself in echo chambers of social media, TikTok, or any other form of media that represents an incomplete or distorted picture of reality, if you lose your sense of balance and orientation in your relationships with reality and the people in it, you may eventually cross that event horizon and you will be lost. Once you are lost, once you are no longer able to control your impulses or even distinguish your impulses from rational thought, you may reach a point where you decide it would be a great idea to murder a loving husband and father of two children. You might reach a point where it seems like a great idea to plant a bomb at the Olympic Games and kill a 44-year-old mother who was there to enjoy the festivities with her daughter. I do not believe for a minute that Charlie Kirk deserved what he got or that he invited it upon himself. From what I can tell, he was a champion of conversation and welcomed a variety of people into meaningful conversations, whether they agreed with him or not. I can make a strong argument that it is, in fact, sustained constructive conversations that are the best way to keep the most vulnerable among us from creeping toward the event horizon. This kid that murdered Charlie Kirk didn't commit this act because of the conversations Charlie Kirk was facilitating for his audience, but rather because he refused to participate in them or even listen to what was actually being said. I think when all is said and done and the investigation is over and Charlie's body is laid into the ground to rest, history will show that his killer had no motive, no logical rationale for what he did. Instead, this was a perpetrator who did what he did because he fell over the cliff. He went past the event horizon. He lost his connection to reality. He fell prey to a fictitious and distorted understanding of who Charlie Kirk was and what he was actually trying to do. And so, like lost souls of the past who stepped past the event horizon, John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald, Timothy McVeigh, Ted Kaczynski, Eric Rudolph, and now Tyler Robinson, they became so lost to reality that they lost their ability to express themselves or formulate rational thoughts with even an ounce of logic. And so all that was left, the only conduit they had to channel their rage or their craving to have some kind of apparent relevance in their pathetic lives, was to carry out some of the most horrific acts of violence possible, to harm the most prominent people they might have access to, and to demoralize and crush the hopes of the followers these individuals touched. It's hard to accept. It's hard to accept that the most beloved, the most followed, the most influential, and the most impactful human beings can be cut down by nobodies. People who have been lost to reality. We have a hard time accepting that the weak can destroy the strong, or that the evil can prey upon the great. So we succumb to the temptation of believing that someone like Charlie Kirk must have been killed by them in a grand and horrific act of organized evil, when in fact, Charlie Kirk appears to have been cut down in his prime and with so much promise ahead of him by an individual who, for whatever reason, went past the event horizon and became a complete and utter nobody. That is really hard to take, and it's really hard to understand. Killing Charlie Kirk didn't make Tyler Robinson a somebody. What it did was confirm that he was anything but a somebody. As you know, my goal on this show is to talk about crime in the United States, how we investigate it, and how the courts use information and expertise to determine who is innocent and who is guilty. I don't share these thoughts with you to pontificate or preach, and I should disclose that there are people out there who have much more expertise than I do in politics and certainly human psychology. I am a professional coach, trained and experienced as I may be, but being a coach does not make you a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist. Our goal here is to understand what an event like this tells us about the state of affairs in our country and what it says about how safe we actually are as a citizenry. What has happened in the era of mass communication, and now more acutely in the era of social media, is that disrespectful, inflammatory language is incentivized because it attracts attention, likes, and clicks. It builds audiences, and it allows various influencers or personalities to monetize their videos, podcasts, or whatever form of media they're producing. This has, I mean, without question, exposed our political leaders, our public officials, and other people in our society who are in a position to set a good or bad example for civilized behavior, to follow the lead of the noisemakers, the conspiracy theorists, and the angry malcontents. Respectful, courteous language has gone out of style in too many circles. Calm, thoughtful discussions about important topics are not swipe worthy. We are seeing uncivilized, negligent behavior across the entire political spectrum, and that is so tragic because you can, in fact, be strong and hold firm. You can express strong viewpoints, and you can be emphatic in your rhetoric while doing so in a respectful and thoughtful way. The shame of all this is that Charlie Kirk was a prime example of how to do that. It doesn't mean he never got angry or never raised his voice to make a point. Of course he did. There's nothing wrong with that when the moment calls for it. But as far as I can tell, Charlie Kirk was setting a great example, not only for the young people who came to his college campus events by the thousands, but also for our political and civic leaders. He was demonstrating how you engage in vigorous debate in a way that elevates people's intellect and connects them more securely to reality. And you didn't have to agree with Charlie to enjoy that benefit. You only needed to listen to the conversation, consider what was being said on both sides of an argument, and participate if you were so inclined. The public safety implications here are are enormous because some of the most influential voices in our country on the right and on the left are being misunderstood by the most valuable, excuse me, the most vulnerable in our society. Even if someone calls President Trump a fascist, for example, a reasonable individual with a strong connection to reality will strive to understand what a fascist is, what the motives are of the individuals using that word, and decide for themselves whether that is true. When people on the right accused Bill Clinton of coming for their guns and advocating for a new world order that would destroy America as we know it, reasonable people with a strong connection to reality could examine that claim and decide for themselves if it was really true. So it may be that the primary goal of our society and what this particular moment in history is demanding of us is not so much to force radical changes in the nature of political rhetoric in the United States, though I think there are some prominent individuals who should consider the impact they're having on the people who are flirting with the event horizon, but rather to teach our kids and our most vulnerable how to think critically about the noise in our society, learn how to turn it off, be thoughtful and intentional about where they get their information, and understand the importance of getting information from a variety of credible sources. It is this connection to reality and the ability to think critically about what one is seeing and hearing, especially from hotbed social media channels, that prevents the kinds of horrors that fell upon Charlie Kirk and our entire nation last week. I also feel especially bad for our police officers out there, as I've talked about before on this show. It's easy to say that you support our police in their mission, but if you are an influencer enabling the pushing of our most vulnerable citizens over the event horizon, pushing those with the most fragile connections to reality past the point of no return, then you are contributing to the destabilization of our society, and you are therefore putting police at risk to a degree that may not be obvious. It is this destabilization that leads to evil, that leads to violence. How can we expect our police to put their lives on the line when we have prominent, sometimes very wealthy, and influential individuals across the media spectrum creating so much rhetorical chaos? For for me personally, and you probably feel the same way, one of the things I look for when I seek reliable sources of information are experts or people in the know who are not so entrenched in their own ideology that they are unwilling to acknowledge even an iota of legitimacy coming from the opposing side. And in their minds, their guy or their gal can do absolutely no wrong. The best sources of information, although they may lean to one side of the spectrum or the other, enable a full understanding of reality and are willing to acknowledge the value of points of view coming from individuals they might typically disagree with, even vehemently. But it's the dug in, entrenched ideologues who cannot be trusted to keep us fully and completely connected to reality. And for this reason, I think a major and potentially ground-shaking reckoning is coming with regards to social media and to the hidden identities of troublemakers and those who fund them, as we are learning about now and who I hope to discuss in a future episode, who hide across the internet. These are individuals who back in the day when I was young were the ones sitting in bathroom stalls writing vulgar messages and drawing dirty pictures on the doors. Now they have access to the rest of us. Even worse, they have access to each other and can form communities of malcontents who are not only disconnected from reality, but have no interest in it whatsoever and are committed to poisoning our society with their insanity. Those are the hands grasping and clawing to pull our most vulnerable past the point of no return, and their grip is strong. So, in the final analysis, a lovely wife and two young children lost a man who meant the world to them. A country lost a young but historically effective orator, debater, and facilitator of robust and meaningful conversation. All of us lost an example of what it looks like to engage people in a vigorous but respectful way, whether you always agreed with him or not. And I'm sure he wasn't perfect, and he may have had his own demons to contend with, as we all do. But it is quite possible that a president of the United States was assassinated last week. Not a current president or a past president, but a future president. We'll never know, will we? I don't know that it's possible or realistic to think that we can convince the most bombastic and destabilizing voices out there to change their tunes or their styles, but we can teach our young people how to recognize credibility and trustworthiness when they see it. Trust me, I think I know this as well as anyone. If you encourage and strengthen the hearts and minds of those in the audience, the message of the speaker and the behavior of the influencers will respond in kind. Charlie Kirk wasn't just pushing a message, he was accelerating the maturity of an audience of millions. That will be his legacy. And that legacy will never be taken away from him or his family. Thank you again, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Crime in the Courtroom. As always, the opinions expressed on our show are those of your host, John Collins, that's me, as well as our guests, and should not be construed as representing the opinions of our sponsors, collaborators, or any other professionals or organizations with whom we may be affiliated. Just as a quick reminder, if you are interested in our world-class on-demand and affordable training program for building your authoritative presence and conflict management skills, please visit criticalvictories.com/showupstrong. And if you are a police commander, forensic scientist, or laboratory administrator, or a professional in a high responsibility occupation looking for a powerful but convenient way to achieve the high resolution self-awareness necessary to be at your best even when everything is on the line, please check out my coaching page at criticalvictories.com/coaching. That's criticalvictories.com/coaching. You can start the process right now without any obligation, and I would love to work with you and any members of your team striving to build the skills and internal strength they need to meet whatever new or growing responsibilities they've been entrusted with. We will see you next time for another edition of Crime in the Courtroom. Let's all be safe, be great, and let's all stay committed to being a force for good and for protecting our quality of life from sea to shining sea. Thanks, everyone.